23 cases of lead poisoning.
Dangerous levels of lead for cinnamon that could contain lead.
Lead. That you might have some lead.
I feel like I've uncovered something. And that's crazy to say because all this information is public, but I think the average person just has no idea how bad it is. This is a block of pure lead. 5 times the lethal dose. And this stuff is absolutely everywhere. I was able to buy this on Amazon. And if that doesn't terrify you, it should. In just the last year, the US has found lead in applesauce, Lunchables, children's Halloween costumes, Stanley cups, and most recently, tampons. Studies estimate that 1/3 of children globally have unacceptable levels of lead in their blood. How is lead getting into everything? We've always known that lead is bad for us. This might surprise you, but even the ancient Romans knew that lead was toxic. Vitruvius, one of Caesar's engineers, commented on the fact that water from clay pipes was much healthier than water from lead pipes. If we knew it was toxic, why have we continued using lead for thousands of years? If lead is the devil's metal, why do we keep making a deal with the devil? Well, the answer is simple. Lead just makes everything better. If it didn't kill you, we would consider it some kind of a miracle material. It's cheap, it doesn't rust, and it's easy to work with. You can even melt it over a campfire. If you add it to spoiled wine, it unspoils the wine. That's one of the reasons why Romans drank out of lead vessels. If you mix lead with sulfuric acid, it creates electricity. That's how the battery in your car works. If you add it to paint, the paint dries faster, lasts longer, and has a brighter color. The Golden Gate Bridge was painted red because you can make red, yellow, or white pigment from lead. There's that phrase, lead paint stare, to describe older people, and it's not the kindest phrase, but there is some truth there. Today, most cases of lead poisoning in America come from paint. The US banned lead paint in 1978, but an estimated 35% of houses still contain lead paint. This is especially dangerous to children because lead paint tastes sweet for the same reason that the Romans added it to their wine, and so children will often try to eat paint chips. A child can get lead poisoning and even die from eating a single paint chip the size of a quarter. Fortunately, if the lead paint is sealed in by new paint, you're okay. But during home renovations or when paint starts chipping, that's when lead poisoning usually occurs. Now, we could have avoided all of this. Benjamin Franklin specifically warned us against the dangers of lead paint. And the League of Nations, that's the precursor to the UN, actually tried to ban lead paint globally in 1921. And yet today, over 100 years later, lead paint is still legal in 52% of countries globally. And so what do you think happens when you order something that was made in one of those countries? Well, here's where things get scary. You probably think there's like some guy at the border testing all these products. There's not. The US has almost no regulations for imported lead products. We check food, consumables, and products intended for children under 12, but this creates some weird loopholes. For example, in 2017, Target was found to be selling fidget spinners with concerningly high levels of lead. But they just said, hey, these fidget spinners, well, they're for kids 14 and up. So it's totally fine. And they kept selling them. They kept the product on the shelf, and that was totally legal. If you don't think this is terrifying, you're not paying attention. Let's say you want to buy some jewelry. Surely the US government wouldn't let people put lead in jewelry, right? Well, let's look at the CPSC website. It says there are no mandatory federal requirements specifically for jewelry when it comes to lead content. So that $2 necklace you purchased from Temu might be a little suspect.
This car can draw its gasoline from either of 2 containers. This one contains ethyl gasoline, and this one contains ordinary gasoline.
Leaded gas has anti-knock properties. Now, in the simplest terms, and I'm sure car people are gonna get mad at me for oversimplifying this, but there are thousands of small explosions happening in your car's engine when you're driving. And sometimes those explosions can happen at the wrong time, but leaded gas prevents this.
And see how we have to cut our speed to get rid of it? Now we're switching over to ethyl gasoline as the car continues up the hill. Is there a knock? Let's listen. No, sir. The speedometer picks up speed at the touch of a toe, thanks to ethyl gasoline.
The man who invented leaded gas, Thomas Midgley, unsurprisingly, got lead poisoning. Did that change his thinking? Did he realize the error of his ways and say, my God, lead is toxic. What are we doing putting it into gasoline? No. While he was recovering from lead poisoning, he called his business associate and said, can you imagine how much money we're gonna make with this? Not so fun fact, Thomas Midgley was also the man who invented Freon, the chemical that destroyed the ozone in the 70s and 80s. The world loved leaded gas because it was genuinely better. It was better for cars, but worse for humans. We're still living with the effects of leaded gas today. The last country to ban it was Algeria in 2021, which is really recent, but even the US didn't fully phase it out until 1996. That's the same year that Crash Bandicoot was released for PlayStation. At the peak of leaded gasoline usage in the US, blood lead levels were 500 to 1,000% higher than they are today. This may be one of the reasons why lead is in tampons. Because of decades of leaded gas usage, lead is actually in our soil. And so when we grow things like cotton, it actually takes some of that lead with it. Some even theorize that leaded gas changed the fabric of society itself. The lead crime hypothesis posits that the rise in crime that we saw in the 70s and 80s was actually due to developmental issues and antisocial behavior arising from lead exposure, especially during childhood. Lead exposure literally makes you stupider. It makes your brain not work as well. One study estimated that lead is responsible for a collective loss of 824 million IQ points. And this theory attributes the decrease in crime in the 90s and 2000s to, you guessed it, banning leaded gas. Crime is obviously a complex phenomenon with a lot of inputs, so I'm not 100% convinced, but it's a fascinating theory nevertheless. Now, if it sounds crazy to you that a hunk of metal can cause people to commit crimes, you're not alone. It's worth taking a minute to explain the bizarre ways that lead affects the human body. Your body needs calcium for a lot of essential functions. Remember the Got Milk commercials? They really had us convinced that Britney Spears was like chugging milk before going on stage. Your body has a hard time telling the difference between lead and calcium. And so when you are exposed to lead, your body starts using lead for processes that need calcium. This causes some very funky symptoms. Our brains need calcium, and so lead sneaks in there and causes lowered IQ, irritability, fatigue, and developmental issues in children. Because it mimics calcium, lead can be stored in your bones for up to 30 years. That's one of the biggest problems with lead exposure, is sometimes its full effects aren't felt until years later. And this is a major problem because a recent study estimates that 50% of Americans had elevated levels of lead exposure as children. When it comes to lead poisoning, many Americans immediately think of Flint, Michigan. And for good reason. Almost 10% of pipes in America are still made of lead. Lead is so useful for making pipes. The word plumbing actually comes from the Latin word for lead, plumbum. That's also where we get lead's atomic symbol from. Interestingly, places with hard water face less risk from lead pipes. You know that like white mineral powder that coats your shower head and your tea kettle? Well, that also coats the inside of lead pipes and offers some protection against the lead leaching into the water. For this reason, Roman lead pipes may not have been as dangerous as we once thought because their water was very hard. It came from mountains with a lot of limestone. Most American cities add an anti-corrosive to their tap water to prevent lead leaching. And this was one of the biggest mistakes made in Flint, Michigan. They did not add that anti-corrosive to the water, and so a ton of lead was allowed to leach into the city's water supply. You might think of lead as something from the past, but we use more lead today than ever before in human history. This is largely for two purposes. Number one is batteries. 85% of all lead in the world right now is being used for batteries. And the second is ammunition. Most bullets still contain lead. Clearly, America has a lead problem, but it's much, much worse in the developing world. Globally, that is where most cases of lead poisoning still occur. Some studies estimate that 1 in every 2 children in the developing world has higher than acceptable levels of lead. This kind of makes sense. Lead makes things cheaper and better, and so in countries that don't have a lot of resources and lack regulation, lead finds its way into a lot more things. But there's a darker side to this. Increasingly, lead smelting and recycling operations are being pushed out of America and into the developing world. This has led to a proliferation of informal recycling sites, which often poison the area around them with lead. In a particularly dystopian twist, one informal recycler even goes live on TikTok. Thousands of people watch this man put his life at risk for 92 cents a pound, which is the current cost of lead. But all hope is not lost. You only need to look at one of the scariest and most insidious cases of lead poisoning I've seen recently. Turmeric in Bangladesh. You see, lead chromate has a bright yellow color and makes the spice weigh more, which means more profits for its producers. In 2019, a study found that 47% of all samples of turmeric in Bangladesh contained lead. But rather than ignore it, the government decided to intervene dramatically, and just 2 years later, lead was found in 0% of samples collected. This intervention saved thousands of lives at an estimated cost of $1 per life. That is an amazing investment if I've ever heard one. We can see a historical record of lead in Earth's atmosphere by drilling ice cores. It tells a story of human ambition and greed. You can see the rise of the Greek and Roman empires, a dip during the Black Plague, and a massive, massive spike during the Industrial Revolution and the adoption of leaded gas. But I think what we should pay the most attention to is this falling line, because it represents that when we care enough, we have the ability to make change. So I wanted to show my cube of pure lead again at the ending, but you know, I thought this is really stupid. Like, if I get lead poisoning while making this video, would that not be the most ironic, idiotic thing? So this is staying in the bag. I'm never touching this again.